Hello and welcome to this tutorial in which I'm going to be covering everything you need to know about JavaScript arrow functions. So JavaScript arrow functions are a shorter way of writing functions in JavaScript, but there's also one important functional difference between arrow functions and regular functions, and that is that arrow functions can return a value by default. That is to say, without using the return keyword. So let's start by looking at the basic syntax of an arrow function by rewriting this function compare strict. So the first thing we do when writing an arrow function is to define the parameters. Notice that we're not using the keyword function. Next comes the arrow, and then inside curly brackets we write the function statement in the same way that we do with a regular function. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in here. So the regular function and arrow function are now almost functionally equivalent, except for one important difference, which is the arrow function is anonymous. So how can you call an anonymous function? The solution is to store the function in a variable. So I'm going to call this compare strict arrow, which converts it to a function expression. I can now call the arrow function in the same way that I would a regular function. So compare strict arrow would be a reference to the function. If I want to execute it, I have to add the parentheses. And of course, if you want to run it properly, you have to add some arguments. So I'm going to add two names that are not the same and see what it returns. So I'll say Stan and Will. And I'm going to log what this arrow function is returning to the console so we can see it. And just for comparison purposes, I'm going to also log the output of the ordinary function so you can see that they are returning the same result. So if we head to the console, the output should be false, false. Okay. Now, something you should be aware of when using arrow functions in this way is that a function expression, unlike a regular function, is not hoisted. So this means that you can only call or reference the compare strict arrow function after it has been defined. So if I try to call it before it's been defined, this will not work. Whereas if I do this for the regular function, it is going to work. So you can see here that the regular function returns false, but for the arrow function, it's returning an uncaught reference error, cannot access compare strict arrow before initialization. So if you are somebody like me who likes to define all of your functions at the bottom of your script, arrow functions are not a good solution because they are not hoisted like ordinary functions. So the next thing I want to talk about is how you can make an arrow function return a value by default. So I'm going to place this console log again below the compare strict arrow function so it works again. So the first thing you need to do to make an arrow function return a value by default is delete the curly brackets. Now, if after that arrow you place a one-line code statement that returns a value, that's going to be the return value of the compare strict arrow function. So it won't work with the function statement as it was written previously because this is over 2 lines. But you'll notice that what's happening in this function is it's returning the value of res, which is the result of item 1 strict equality test with item 2. So I can just copy this test, place it on the right hand side of the arrow, and the return value of this function is now going to be the true or false value returned by the comparison. Now you can make an arrow function even shorter if it has a single parameter by deleting the parentheses around the parameter, but in this case it won't work because there are 2 parameters, so I'm going to leave them as they are, but this is a way that you can write an even shorter arrow function. Now, before you go crazy using arrow functions, there is an important gotcha that I want to show you, and that is when you use an arrow function to define a method within an object. So in this object, the first 2 properties are first name and last name, and then we have 2 methods defined within the object. One is a method defined with a regular function, and the other is written as an arrow method. Now, it can be tempting to use an arrow function in this context because a method is an anonymous function without a name, and an arrow function is always anonymous, which is why you have to store it in a variable to be able to call it in the previous example. Now, both of these functions do the same thing, so they log this to the console, which you would expect to be my object, and then they return the first name property space last name property. So I'm going to call both of these methods and log the result to the console. So I'll start with regular method. So that's my object dot regular method, and I want to call that. Head over to the browser, refresh. So you can see that running the function has logged the object to the console. So this is the value for the keyword this, and the return value of the function is first name space last name. So what you would expect. Now let's see what happens if I use the arrow function. So instead I'm going to call the arrow method, refresh that in the console, and this time you can see what's been logged to the console is the global object. So that's probably not what you were expecting, and as a result, trying to log this dot first name to the console, that would be the property first name in the global object, which doesn't exist, so it returns undefined, and the same occurs for trying to log last name on the window object. So this is a major gotcha when you're using arrow functions in objects. So the bottom line is that you should avoid using arrow functions to define methods in objects. So moving on from this example of when not to use arrow functions, let's take a look at an ideal use case for arrow functions, and that is defining a function within a method call. So a big part of the reason why arrow functions are so useful in this context is that they can return a value by default, unlike a regular function. So to demonstrate, let's make a method call that accepts a function that filters out the values Saturday and Sunday from this array. So the method call I would make in this context is filter, and filter expects a function. So with a regular function, I say function, it accepts an anonymous function, so I don't give this function a name, and then within the function I have access to each item in the array. Now when this function is applied to each item in the array, it will be kept in the new array that filter produces if the return value for that particular element is true. If it's false, then the element will not be included in the new array. So I want to return false for Saturday and Sunday, not for the other days. So what I want to do here is create a check that is only going to return true for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc., and not for Saturday and Sunday. So I can do that by checking does item not equal sat, and does item not equal sun. Now, because this is a regular function, I need to remember to include the return keyword as well. So the passed in function returns something, true or false. Because filter doesn't touch the existing array, I need to store the result somewhere. So I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call that filter regular. Now, if I log filter regular to the console, it should return an array with the values Saturday and Sunday filtered out. So I'm going to refresh the browser now, and you can see that that has worked as expected. So there's nothing wrong with passing in a regular function to a method call, but arrow functions were really designed for this purpose. So let's rewrite the filter method call, passing in an arrow function instead of a regular one. So I'm going to save this in a variable called filter arrow. Again, I'm going to call the filter method on the days array. Now, because there's only one parameter, it's possible to omit the parentheses around it. So I can just say item, and then comes the arrow. Now I can, if I want, write this arrow function in the same way as the function above, but this is a lot longer than it needs to be. So what I can do here is delete the curly braces. I don't need the return keyword because this arrow function returns a value by default. And I can also delete this semicolon because it's not the end of the line. That would go there. And I'm going to log the result to the console just to show you that it is doing exactly the same thing as when we passed in the regular function to the method call. So this is a use case where you can sometimes dramatically reduce the amount of syntax you're writing using arrow functions, and it is now arguably easier to read too. So that is all you need to know about JavaScript arrow functions to start using them in your own project. Now, if you found this video useful, please consider supporting the channel by clicking the like button on this video and also subscribing to the channel so you can see more content like this from us in the future.